Hi, and welcome to the Caterpillar Cross Stitch YouTube channel. My name's Ford from Son of a Stitch, and this week I'm going to be talking about embroidery hoops. And I hate to be the bearer of bad news, but you're probably using them wrong. Especially if you use these plastic ones and you think they don't work very well. I have a life-saving tip for you at the end of this video, so make sure you stick around. We're just going to jump right in here, but first things first, make sure you hit subscribe so you don't miss any of the future videos on the channel. Give this video a like and leave it a comment because that's how my performance is tracked, and it really helps me a lot if you do, so I would really appreciate it if you would. Now, my name of the video and the introduction is a little bit cheeky because it's not necessarily that people are using their hoops wrong, except for the last tip that I'm going to tell you about. It's more that there's a way that a lot of people have never thought of using it that can make a really big difference for some people. So I want to share that with you. If you follow the channel, you've probably seen me talk about this a little bit in the past, but it seemed like it was time to make a full video about the reasons that I stitch this way. And that is a method that I call stitching in the well. So really there are two ways that you can load your fabric into your hoop. Take a look here. Most of the time when people stitch, they put the working surface of their fabric on the top side of the hoop so that you have like the recessed area of the hoop is on the back, and then your working piece is flush with the top of the hoop here. That's the way you usually see it done, and that's the way most of us were taught to do it, and that's the way I started doing it as well. But I discovered a few problems that I accidentally solved by stitching in another way. So the big problem that I discovered is that when you get, so I've just finished these stitches right here in last week's video, you should check that out if you haven't already. And when I'm ready to bury my needle underneath those stitches that I've completed, if I run my needle underneath those stitches, I encounter a problem where now my needle is butting up against the edge of my hoop. And in order to get that out and finish off tying off those stitches, I either need to take my project out of my hoop, or I need to really like pull the needle and bend it a bit to get it up around the edge of that hoop. And I have broken needles in this way. I've also bent needles, and I've damaged my fabric sometimes too, so that can be a little bit of a pain. And then usually I want to run my stitches back in the opposite direction too, and that's even harder to get my needle underneath there. So one day I was stitching and I accidentally put my fabric in my hoop upside down, and I was too lazy to fix it, so I just started stitching that way, and it was a game changer, because check this out. So what I've done here is I've loaded my fabric upside down in my hoop, or I've loaded my hoop upside down on my fabric, depending on your frame of reference or perspective there. So now when I want to bury my finished thread underneath those existing stitches and I need to run my needle underneath there, my hoop is no longer in my way. So I don't have to move my hoop around as often. It puts less wear and tear on the fabric. It saves me time. It creates fewer barriers to continuing to stitch for me. And one of the things about managing my ADHD with my stitching is eliminating those barriers for myself. So by loading it this way, I don't have to stop stitching as frequently, and I can make more progress, especially at a time when I'm changing out needles or changing out colors. That's a real danger time for me to get distracted because I've been interrupted and my flow has been damaged. So not having to move the hoop when that happens is a really, really big advantage for me. So I really like to stitch it that way. There are other big advantages of it for me as well, because it opens up other ways of holding the hoop. So I can hold my hoop like this, or I can put my index finger inside there and hold my hoop like this. And being able to change up my grip and the way I'm holding the hoop really helps me reduce the stress and the pain that I get in my hoop holding hand. It's never my stitching hand that hurts, it's always my hoop holding hand. So that really helps as well. You'll also notice that when I'm holding the hoop this way, I'm not touching the front of my project as much. I'm touching the back of my project or touching the hoop itself a lot more. So my fabric gets a lot less dirty, which makes it a lot easier for me to clean when I'm done. Because especially the parts that get the dirtiest are the parts where I hold onto it. So if you look at the way you hold it when it's loaded for stitching, what I call stitching on the drum, that's just my personal name for it, you'll notice that in order to hold the hoop, I have to put my thumb on the fabric, because I can't I can't really hold it like this. I have nothing to grip. So doing it with stitching, what I call stitching in the well, the way I've loaded the fabric here, I can hold on to just the hoop. I can actually apply tension to it. I can avoid touching the fabric. And if I'm holding, if I have a bunch of extra fabric I need to gather up, I can even roll it up like this. And again, I'm only touching the back of my project. I'm not touching the front of it. So that's a huge advantage for me too, because it gets the fabric less dirty, which makes my display and finishing process better and easier. Now, the one exception to using the stitching in the well method for me is when I am stitching with French knots. And again, because it's about access to the surface of the fabric. When I'm stitching a French knot, I need to be able to get my fingers onto the surface of the fabric. And if I'm stitching in the well, the hoop can get in the way. So if I'm doing French knots, I will do those French knots stitched on the drum because it's easier for me to get to the surface of the fabric when I'm doing that. This is especially important when you're doing a smallish project with a smallish hoop. The bigger they both get, the much less of an issue that becomes. But especially, I really like to do small projects, so the hoop gets in my way a lot if I'm not careful about how I load my fabric. My next tip is a little bit more esoteric, but I want to remind you before I go into it to join the Caterpillar Cross Stitch VIP Stitch Club. When you join, you'll get an instant download of an ebook with 8 free PDF cross stitch patterns in it. Plus, you'll get a year-long temperature tracking stitch-along pattern, which is new to that, and it's really, really cool, so I recommend that. Make sure you hit the link down there in the description so that you can get all the great perks from being a VIP stitcher. Now, the next way that people use hoops wrong is not necessarily about the way they're using the hoop, but it's about the hoops that they're using. If you're in a craft store, you'll see these really inexpensive $2 or $3 or whatever the equivalent is in your local currency hoops in the stitching aisle. And when you see a $3 hoop, it's really hard to understand why you might buy a $10 or $12 hoop. But those inexpensive hoops that you see at the craft store, they're not really for stitching. They're for displaying. They're for finishing your project in and displaying them. The way that they're machined and the materials that they're made from are not as good as the materials that you'll find in a higher quality hoop, like this really nice Boan hoop that I've got right here. Because of just the shape profile of it and the wood that it's made from, it holds tension in my project much, much better. So it requires a lot less fiddling and adjusting while I'm working. And then when I'm finished with the project, I'll sand and stain one of those cheap hoops from the craft store and I'll display it in that. And there are a lot of things that are better on a high quality hoop, like these Boan ones or the Nerge ones that you can get from Caterpillar Cross Stitch's store. One big difference is the strength of these brackets here. On a cheap hoop, as you try to tighten this down, instead of cinching up this outer hoop, which is what it's supposed to do, these little prongs will just start to bend because they're made of a cheaper, less stiff metal. So when you try to cinch it down so you can put some tension on your hoop and hold it there, it'll just bend those prongs instead. They'll also have like more coarsely machined parts, and sometimes they won't be made of brass, so like this thing will get stuck and weld itself together, which is very bad. But they're just a better quality and a better process that's used to make a higher quality hoop. So for your stitching, I recommend having a nicer hoop, and then get those cheaper ones to replace them with at the end when you're ready to display. I promised you a life-changing tip about how to use these plastic hoops if you've struggled with them in the past. This is something that I learned in one of the online communities that I'm in, so I recommend being in those because they're an amazing wealth of knowledge, especially the Caterpillar Cross Stitch Facebook group and the Caterpillar Cross Stitch Instagram. There are tens of thousands of stitchers in those two spaces with a combined hundreds of thousands of years of experience. So there's so much knowledge available just for the asking in that space that it'd be a shame not to take advantage of it. So make sure you go and check both of those out. Now, this is a very popular brand of plastic embroidery hoop that a lot of us have, and I see a lot of posts online from people complaining that they don't hold tension in the fabric very well. And this is the real inspiration for my topic tease of this video, is that this hoop, this kind of hoop, is very frequently actually used wrong, and it's because the instructions are really hard to see. So let's take a closer look here and I'll show you what I'm talking about. All right, even zoomed in like this, you can barely see it, but maybe if I can create a little more contrast for you, there we go. You see how that says this side up? It's barely visible and a lot of people miss that instruction. But what it's telling you is that that side of the fabric, or that side of the hoop, should be against the fabric. The reason that's the case is if you look here, there's a little lip on the edge of that inner ring from the hoop. And that little lip is what locks in the tension on the fabric. So what you want to do is when you're loading your fabric into your hoop, you set it down with the side that says this side up. And then you lay your fabric on top of that side. And then you press your hoop over that. Now I'm going to load this as though I'm stitching on the drum instead of in the well. And then you'll push that all the way past that little ring. And then tighten it down a little bit, pull the slack out of the fabric, and tighten that down the rest of the way. That way, you can see, let's zoom in again, the fabric kind of wraps around that little lip before it goes into the hoop. And that gives the hoop a lot more surface area, a lot more grip and friction tension to keep that fabric from just sliding through there. Now because the hoop is a little bit slippery, if it doesn't have that lip, then the fabric will just pull out and you won't be able to maintain any tension in it, which is the problem that people frequently report with these kinds of hoops. Once they understand how to load it, then people have a much better experience with them. So loading it correctly can really make a big difference for you. So make sure that if you're using these kinds of hoops that you check them for any sort of an instruction like that, because this brand is not the only one that has kind of an counterintuitive means of loading the fabric that prevents people from getting the most out of it. So those are the biggest ways that I wanted to talk about that people use their hoops wrong. Or what about you? Is there some sort of special trick that you've discovered or something that you found out that you were doing wrong with your hoop or maybe one of your other cross-stitching tools? Leave it in the comments down below so one of the other viewers can benefit from your experience. Don't forget to like this video, leave me a comment, subscribe to the channel. Those all really help me out. Other than that, I do want to thank you so much for watching. For Caterpillar Cross Stitch, my name is Ford, and I will see you next time.